Good evening to everyone. It's so good to see you here this evening. Passover, happy Passover, Pesach Sameach to all of you. My name is Aaron Horowitz, and I'm head of the Megalim Institute. That's the higher institute for Jerusalem studies in the city of David. And we deal extensively with archaeology, history, Bible study, education. And this evening, I'm happy to present a short lecture on a very fascinating topic in my eyes, the madness and magnificence of Herod the Great. Now, everyone in Israel knows who Herod is, and he's especially popular with the tour guides because almost everywhere you go in Israel, you will find a tourist site where there are remains, beautiful remains, from the great buildings that Herod built 2,000 years ago. Anywhere you go, you will see, or if you see in Masada, the hanging palace in Masada, for instance, the beautiful theater in Caesarea, and the artificial mountain, man-made mountain, palace, fortress, mausoleum of Herod the Herodian. These are superb, beautiful areas and sites, and you can see superb architecture and really eloquent beauty in the desert. And of course, that's why these sites are so popular, but they're not the only ones that Herod built. Herod was a great builder. He had dozens of building projects in and around Judea. He had, even outside of Judea, he had many outside the kingdom. He also built different structures, buildings, aqueducts, markets, and many others. Of course, the most magnificent of all his building achievements was the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, dismantling the old one and rebuilding it in a fashion that we will speak about soon. But in fact, when we come to sum up the building character of King Herod, Professor Magen Broshi writes, Herod wasn't only the greatest builder of the Second Temple period, he was the greatest builder ever in the land of Israel and one of the greatest builders of the ancient world. So we're dealing with a world-class builder, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that this great builder was also a cruel tyrant who massacred many, many thousands of people. Herod, this is the man who wiped out the entire Hasmonean dynasty. This is the man who massacred many of the sages, the rabbis of his day, that opposed his rule on the grounds that they claimed that if the Torah claims that only amongst your brethren can you appoint for yourself a king, Herod was not fully Jewish, according to their view. And Herod had a reign of terror. He killed thousands of people, as I mentioned, the Hasmoneans, the sages, and he didn't stop there. He went on to exterminate much of his own family, his mother-in-law, okay, some of you are going to say that's not so terrible, brother-in-law, beautiful wife Miriam, his own sister and her husband, and 3 of his own sons. Now, some might say, well, that's the name of the game in ancient times, because someone who came to power, as did Herod, and we'll soon see how, had many, many enemies. And of course, even a paranoid can have enemies, as Henry Kissinger once said, and Herod had many. And the reason for this is mostly because Herod came to power by violent means. He was not a successor to the throne. The throne in Judea had been ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty for over 100 years. Under Rome, ever since Pompey conquered Judea in the year 63 before the Common Era, they appointed the high priest from the family of the Hasmoneans to rule over the Jews and rule over the people. But in the year 40, something changed. In the year 40, the Parthians, the arch enemy of the Romans, conquered Judea temporarily, and they appointed one of the Hasmoneans' brothers, this was Matityahu Antigonus, to be king, but on their behalf, not on Rome's behalf. And they imprisoned the earlier king Hyrcanus. Now, Herod, who had belonged to the influence of Rome, and he was the governor of the Galilee under Hyrcanus, escaped Jerusalem at the time and made his way to Rome at an opportune moment, because at exactly this time, Marcus Antonia, that's Mark Antony, together with Octavianus, later to be called Augustus, are already deciding that they want nothing more to do with the Hasmoneans. They want to be rid of this dynasty that governed for them for a long time, but they couldn't be dependent on. Here, they could see that Matithyahu Antigonus, the last of the Hasmonean kings, had joined ranks with their archenemy, and therefore they decided they need someone independent of that dynasty. And guess who happened to be in Rome at the time? Herod. And everyone knew that Herod was a strong man. As governor of the Galilee, he had persecuted the Zealots and other renegades of society, and therefore the Romans decided that he would be the best candidate to rule over Judea at this time, because he was a strong person that could put down any rebellion against Rome, and also he would be dependent and loyal only on the emperor himself, and therefore he would not be open to all kinds of pressures. And therefore he had to go back to Jerusalem and take power, take over the throne. But there was one problem at the time. He was in Rome, and of course Matithyahu Antigonus was still ruling over Jerusalem. So Herod would have to return to Jerusalem and conquer it, this time with Roman legions that would come to his aid. So Herod goes and conquers Jerusalem in a bloody battle, and he goes on to purge everyone from that dynasty, knowing that if any one of the Hasmoneans would be left alive, the people would always favor the Hasmoneans, and he would be in trouble. Therefore, we really have someone who had a lot of enemies, and in fact, perhaps, or some historians try to justify all the killing spree of Herod and the thousands of people that he killed with a justification. Well, he had to hold on to his power. He had to consolidate his rule, and that's how it was done in the ancient times. But apparently, Herod used excessive force, and the fact is that even Augustus, later the emperor of all of the Roman Empire, who himself was probably not a vegetarian, claims in jest that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, because a pig, of course, was not kosher meat, and therefore Jews would not partake of it. On the other hand, Herod seemed to be killing his family wholesale, and therefore it seems that the word got around that Herod was really a bloody tyrant, and perhaps even demented in that way. In fact, he seems to have been paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere, real and imagined. Josephus reports that he set up spies everywhere, so on the cities and in the road, to watch those that met together. He was always suspicious. It is reported that he would sometimes disguise himself as a private individual and mix among the multitude in the nighttime in order to test what opinion they had of his rule. That means he would go up to people and say, "What do you think about King Herod?" And he was disguised, so they didn't recognize him. And if they answered, "Well, I don't much care for that king," well, that was the last time they spoke, isn't it? So yes, this was a man who had fears. This was a man who was perhaps paranoid. This was a man who perhaps was troubled, deeply troubled. In fact, two scholars, Aryeh Kasher, the historian, Professor Aryeh Kasher, Professor Emeritus from Tel Aviv University, and Professor of Psychiatry, Eliezer Witztum, came together to write a book analyzing and trying to diagnose what the mental disorder that Herod had was. And they came to a conclusion, after an extensive study, that Herod had a paranoid personality disorder, what is often known as DSM-4. Now, many scholars came to explain that not only was the killing spree a function of Herod's craziness, his madness, but also this developed into a megalomania. That means that He was delusional in mental illness, and it marked, this is the reason for all his great building, the frenzied, obsessive building that went on in the entire kingdom of his was part of this madness. And many will use the word in term megalomania, which is a delusional mental illness that is marked by feelings of personal omnipotence and grandeur. Basically, Herod thought that he was great, greater, and the greatest. And of course, this affected his behavior. And this, as scholars believe, is what caused him to build all these grand structures all over his kingdom. However, and I totally agree that Herod was certainly a troubled person and perhaps mentally ill. However, I take the advice of William Shakespeare, who said that though this be madness, yet there is method in it. Meaning that even if Herod was mad, we need to try to figure out what building, all this building, came to represent. In fact, I believe that Herod had many faces. And I think that he was using architecture. Each part of his personality, as split as it might have been, was using architecture as a form of communicating. He was saying things. He was speaking to different people in the way he built these buildings. And I would like this evening to come together with you and to listen to the voices of Herod. Try to understand which buildings were built for what purpose. Basically, we're going to ask, even though we can agree that Herod was mentally ill, we're still thinking that he was someone every day. Who are you today, Herod? We're going to ask him. And what are your buildings saying? So we begin our journey with one of the faces of Herod, Herod the Fearful. We just now described how Herod was basically paranoid and he had great fears. It's true that he had good reason to fear because he had many, many enemies. Almost everyone in his kingdom wanted to kill him. He had enemies from all over. So how do the buildings that he built reflect this fear and paranoia? So I call this category the flight or flee buildings. And in this category, we have first and foremost Herod's first palace. Now, when Herod came to power in Jerusalem, he needed a palace. He had just betrothed the beautiful Miriam from the Hasmonean dynasty. He left her alive to marry her. They had been engaged for a long time, but now he married her and he needed to bring her to her first home. And he didn't move out to a nice home in the suburbs. He brought her to the first home that he built for her, and she must have asked, but Herod, this isn't a home, it's a fortress. And indeed it was. Herod built a huge fortress to the north of the Temple Mount. He named it Antonia after his mentor, Mark Anthony. And this fortress was indeed humongous. It was erected upon a rock of 50 cubits. It's about 25 meters high, just the hill upon which, the hill of Antonia, upon which the fortress was built. And this fortress was surrounded by 4 huge towers that reached a height of 45 meters. And on these towers were guards 24/7 guarding over Herod, and he even had a secret tunnel underneath the fortress should someone manage to infiltrate to escape by night. Now, Herod was being watched over in this fortress of Antonia, but he was also watching over because this fortress was built just above the Temple Mount. Now, in the Temple Mount and the holidays, thousands of people, like Pesach, like today, came to congregate for the pilgrimages. And this was a time that many could be incited to riot against the regime, against this tyrant Herod. So Herod wanted to be the first to know if trouble was beginning and stirring. And of course, he would probably be saying to the people down below, you better behave yourself. So these are fight or flee buildings. Of course, the ultimate example of a flee fortress would be the fortress of Masada, the palace fortress, because with all the beautiful lavish dwellings that Herod built there, and there are many with swimming pools and really beautiful frescoes lining the walls, but nevertheless, one cannot escape the idea that This is in the middle of nowhere. It's in the Judean desert, just arriving at the location of it, not to speak of climbing this great mountain, I'm sure many of you have, is almost impossible. So in fact, this is the ideal escape getaway. And basically what Herod, fearful Herod, is saying here is, you'll never get me. This is paranoid Herod at his greatest. He's finding the most secluded place. He never actually ran away to hide there, but nevertheless, he built it up. I have to mention now that most of these places that Herod is building, he is not the first to do building. For instance, Masada here was first built up by the Hasmoneans, but the person that fortified and built it and the great lavish buildings was Herod. He is going to do a lot of that. In Hebrew, we call it a shiputznik, yes? He is building upon other things that already existed. Now, a lot of examples for the fight or flee fortresses we find in the Judean desert. We have Alexandrion, that's south of Dok, and Cyprus above Jericho, Hyrcania, Machaerus in the Transjordan, Masada, and Herodion, and there are many others. Now we come to another category of Herod's building that reflects another face or another part of his personality. Herod the inferior. Now, I don't mean to say that Herod was inferior, and that's why the word is put in quote, but people related to Herod as if he was inferior, and as Kasher and Winston claim, he had an inferior complex. And why did people look down on Herod? Because Herod was not from royal blood. He was not from the Hasmonean dynasty at all, even though he would like people to think that. That's why he married Miriam. But he was not from royal blood. He wasn't even a high priest family. And he wasn't even a priest. In fact, the word on the street was that he wasn't 100% Jewish either. And that stems from his roots, his descent. Herod was an Idumean. He was born in Maresha, in the southern part of Israel. And this was an area that was conquered in the heyday of the Hasmonean kingdom before the Roman occupation. The Hasmoneans conquered large tracts of land, and their policy was to convert the minorities inside so that they would integrate into the Jewish society. Now, this conversion, mass conversion, very often forced conversion, was their policy, but it was often frowned upon by the religious authorities, the Pharisees, the rabbis, who considered this kind of a conversion not kosher. And therefore, Herod, whose grandfather Antipas had been converted in this fashion, Herod was, although third generation Idumean, still considered somewhat inferior from his Jewish lineage. He was considered not of an aristocratic stock. By the way, it wasn't all the Jews who thought of Herod in this fashion. Even the Romans considered him to be of low lineage and perhaps not even worthy to rule, but they took him anyway because, as I mentioned earlier, he would do the job for the Romans. He was the strong man that would do their dirty work. Now, what kind of buildings does someone with an inferior complex build? He builds showcase buildings, buildings that will show everyone that who said I'm inferior, that he's not inferior. So one of the most fantastic and fabulous buildings that Herod built in Jerusalem was his new palace in the upper city. I mentioned the first palace in Antonia, but when after a couple of years, Herod decided he wanted something more larger, more lavish, and since the upper city is turning in at this time into the high society of Jerusalem, Herod built his palace on the highest point there, where today is the Citadel of David, Jaffa Gate. It's 777 meters above sea level, and Herod builds for himself a beautiful, lavish palace at this place. Now, there are two wings to the palace. He names them. It's a bit of a name dropper, Herod, and also showing how maybe people thought he wasn't worthy of being a king, but his best friends were actually Emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus, excuse me, And so he names one of the wings of the palace Caesarion after Augustus, who now has become emperor. He defeated Antonia, the previous mentor, and now Herod has to find a way to show that he appreciates Augustus more than he did Antonia. And he gives him the name of his one of the wings of his new palace. And the other wing he names Agrippion after Augustus' son-in-law and commander of the Roman army, Agrippa. And the name Agrippa is going to, in fact, infiltrate into Judean society. And Herod's grandson and great-grandson will also be called by this name. So here we have a palace, a beautiful palace, which is a showcase. There are beautiful frescoes on the wall, lavish dwellings, the tiled floors, probably opus sectile, a special way of tiling Roman technique, and very beautiful. And so really this was a showcase palace. Anyone who came there knew that Herod was not inferior. This guy must be made of royal stock. But the most interesting feature of this palace was that it had running water. Now, Josephus writes, the grounds were filled with gardens and tree groves, surrounded by canals and pools of water and bronze statues streaming water. But wait a minute, where did the water come from? As we know, Jerusalem only spring is, or close to the city, is the Gihon spring. That's much lower down. The laws of gravitation do not allow for that water to be piped into the palace in the upper city. Where did the water come from? And here, showcasing again, Herod built a spectacular water system. He built two great pools. Today we know Solomon's pools in the hills of Bethlehem, which, as you know, is higher than Jerusalem. We see three pools, but Herod actually built two pools to collect water from streams and springs from the and rainwater from the surrounding area, and to pipe this water to Jerusalem. Now, he wasn't the first to begin this, and actually the lower aqueduct, which piped water to the temple, was built by the Hasmoneans earlier. However, Herod builds another aqueduct from the hills of Bethlehem all the way to Jerusalem, this time not to the temple, but to the upper city, to his palace. So here the difference between Hasmoneans, who are thinking about the temple, and Herod, who is thinking about his lavish palace. But in fact, again, it showcased his palace to be a beautiful and lavish place, and with running water and fountains and pools and anything that you could imagine. Now, next to this palace, Herod built three tremendous towers. Three tremendous towers. Now, these towers, Josephus writes, nothing compared to them in strength and beauty. And these towers had a double function. Number one, they protected King Herod and his palace. Of course, they were located on the city wall next to the gate of the city. So they doubled as a protection for the city itself. But I imagine that Herod had his own safety also in mind when he built these tremendous towers. And he gave them names. The right one, he named Hippocus after his good friend and commander of the cavalry. And the center one, he named Patzael after his brother who committed suicide when the Parthians invaded Jerusalem. And the third, he built the most beautiful and claimed that, of course, the most beautiful tower needed to be named after a woman, and he named it after Miriam, his beautiful Hasmonean wife, who he loved so much that he killed later on out of so much love. But these were tremendously great towers. And again, this is showcasing, especially, I think, is the Patzael Tower. Because, and today, if you go to Jaffa Gate, you go to the Citadel of David, you can still see the base of the Patzael Tower, what is most probably the Patzael Tower. And although only 13 layers of this tower remain, and the rest is Mameluke, yes, together with the Mameluke Tower, it rises to a very high height of 23 meters till this day, and those standing next to it will be impressed with that height. But that's nothing compared to the original height of the Patzael Tower that reached 45 meters into the heavens. Imagine in those days, 45 meters high tower overlooking the entire area. In fact, Josephus claims that Herod modeled it after the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, the lighthouse of Pharos, known as the lighthouse of Pharos, which was considered in those days to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. So imagine that in your backyard of the palace. This is showcasing of Herod par excellence. But perhaps the most impressive building that Herod built to impress was the royal basilica on the extended Temple Mount. And a basilica, as you know, is a public building. It's built for commercial reasons, for sometimes courts hold their sessions there. And in the Temple Mount, or perhaps it was also used for changing money for the pilgrims who came from out of the country. But this building was a public building. And there were many basilicas in the Roman Empire all over the place. It was a common building. It was a building built upon columns. But as Josephus writes, and this basilica deserved to be praised more than anything under the sun. It was huge. And in fact, it was built of 4 rows of columns, 162 columns all told. And as Josephus says, the thickness of each pillar was such that 3 men might, with their arms extended, surround 1 pillar, okay? So we can imagine the height, we can imagine the scale of this basilica. Professor Gabi Barkai claims that this is the biggest building in Israel from 2,000 years ago up until the establishment of the state of Israel. This is the biggest building that existed. So we can imagine that it was quite impressive. And if you wanted to reach this building, you would also walk up a very impressive monumental staircase. We call it, what's left of this, the arch that supported that staircase, Robinson's Arch. And as you can see here from the reproduction, Robinson's Arch, in fact, was a support for a huge monumental staircase that entered into the southern part of the Temple Mount, into the royal basilica, which I've just now described. Now, Robinson's Arch is huge. It's 15.80 meters. And I believe it is the largest stone arch, not brick, but stone arch from ancient times. So this is really, again, showcasing at its best. So basically, what are these buildings coming to say? They're saying, Herod is saying, I'm not inferior. Respect me, revere me. In fact, fear me. Every time you saw the royal basilica or the palace or the towers, you were in fear. And that's what Herod wanted to say. That was his way of communicating. But there were other parts of Herod too. Herod was a statesman. Herod, unlike the Hasmoneans who ruled before him, received a larger constituency. The Hasmoneans under Rome ruled only over the Jewish population. They were not even kings, they were ethnarchs, meaning that they ruled over the ethnic denomination of the Jews. The Greek cities that the original Hasmoneans had conquered were torn away from Judea, and they were independent. But now Herod, when he becomes king, he again becomes the king of Gentiles, of non-Jews. And as a statesman, he has to show that he is not partial, that he's not discriminating, and that all are his subjects. And therefore, he will do a lot of patronage. He will build marketplaces. He will build aqueducts, the famous port city of Caesarea, in areas that are populated mostly by non-Jews. Of course, Herod, the Roman, and this is one part of Herod, which is very important because actually, as I mentioned earlier, Herod, his lineage was Idumean. He was born in Idumean, but his culture from an early age was Roman. And now, because he was educated probably in Ashkelon in Roman schools, and now that is going to take a very important part. He adores Roman civilization and culture, but now it's going to take a part in his ruling, because don't forget, the Romans rely on this person, Herod. They want to know that he identifies with their ideals, with their values. Herod needs to show in his building that he is more Roman than Roman. So he's going to build something that in Jerusalem existed in the Hellenistic period, but certainly was frowned upon by the post-Maccabean rule. He built the theater in Jerusalem. He built a hippodrome, that's for horse racing. Imagine that, in Jerusalem. And he built an amphitheater. Now, the amphitheater was not for plays or music or poetry. It was a violent arena of gladiator versus gladiator or versus wild animal. This was very un-Jewish, and to the chagrin of many of the wise people and the religious authorities, Pharisees of Jerusalem. Herod built this institution to show, again, that he is a Roman. He identifies with the Roman culture. And among the Romans that he wanted to curry their favor, of course, the most important was the emperor himself, Augustus. And to this purpose, Herod built special buildings. In fact, Herod built temples to the Emperor Augustus. He built temples. He was the greatest advocate and most enthusiastic advocate of the emperor cult. These were temples that actually worshipped the emperor himself. And Herod built these temples, not in Jewish Judea, true. He had respect for the Jews as much as that, but he did build one of these temples in Sebastia. One of these temples he built in Caesarea Maritima, in Caesarea, and one in Banyas, and there were others as well. So that was really his highest regard for the emperor. You can see in his Roman buildings. But now we come to the most interesting and the most fascinating of all his building projects, the temple in Jerusalem. Who is Herod speaking to when he takes apart the old temple in Jerusalem and builds a new one? Now, you could say, well, sure, he wants to impress his Roman friends, but no, will Augustus actually be happy about all this? I'm not sure. In fact, this would not be a temple to the worship of the emperor. In fact, there would be no idols in this temple at all, and no Roman insignias, no Roman symbols. The Roman eagle that will be hung on the temple will come much later. At this point, it will be a temple to the one God, and will be a place where people that gather there are religious or have a nationalistic tendency. Rome is not happy that such places could be built, especially if it's built in the style of a fortress in its own right. So who is actually Herod speaking to with this form of building? And consider this, the building would not be easy. In fact, would be Herod's greatest challenge, and I'll explain why. The mountain of Moriah, upon which Herod planned to rebuild the temple, was narrow, and there wasn't enough room there really for the monumental and colossal buildings that Herod wanted to build. He needed to broaden the Temple Mount, this artificial podium upon which he would build the temple. And he built a huge artificial podium. In fact, it's the largest artificial podium in the ancient world. It measured 144,000 square meters. That's the size of about 30 football fields. Imagine that. He doubled the size of the original Temple Mount, which was only 250 meters by 250 meters. Now, imagine the size of this, well, I called it a podium, but the Temple Mount. The walls were huge. In fact, the western wall that we know so well, or a part of it, was 487 meters, almost a half a kilometer long. Now, the Kotel, or the Wailing Wall that is prayed in today, is only 60 meters, a small portion of that large size. And the height of this compound would be 30 meters. This is, in fact, huge. In fact, as I mentioned, the largest holy compound in the ancient world. Of course, to build this, he needed to use huge stones. And I won't go into all the building technique, only to mention that we are always impressed when we see the large size of these stones. For instance, this stone that I measured on the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount is 12 meters long, 180 wide, and 1 high. And doing the math, if we know the volume and the Mishkal Zguri, excuse my Hebrew, I don't know how to say that in English, but the density, I think it's called, of limestone, we come to 56.16 tons just at one stone, and it's not the biggest. We know stones, in fact, in the Kotel Tunnel, you can see a stone close to 600 tons heavy. So, in fact, this was a Heraclean feat that Herod would have to do. Why? Who is he talking to? Who is he trying to communicate? What is this building trying to say? And we should really ask Herod himself. And he has an answer, but I'm not sure we'll take it as face value. Herod, in his speech, when he came to explain to the Jews why he is going to do this fantastic feat, he explains that he's doing it as an act of piety, as a religious act. He says, to make a thankful return after the most pious manner to God for what blessings I have received from him by giving me this kingdom, and that by rendering his temple as complete as I am able. So basically what Herod is trying to convince us is this building, he is speaking to God. And well, okay, I don't think Herod was a pious person one day out of his whole life. In fact, to the end of his days, he continues his cruel rampage, and even a surge of it happened in his later days. I will just mention that the last day of his living life, Herod commanded that on the day of his death, all the notables should be rounded up and taken to the hippodrome and put to death, so that people should not celebrate the death of the tyrant, but rather should be a day of mourning for everybody. So you can see, even to the last day, we are speaking about a bloodthirsty tyrant. But strangely enough, Herod the Pious doesn't work for us, but Herod apparently was in a dialogue here, and he was finding his Jewish roots. Now, I will quote a midrash from the Talmud that speaks about a very interesting incognito meeting that takes place between one of the sages of Jerusalem, Pavel ben Buta was his name, and Herod. I won't go through the entire story, but the end of the story ends as follows, that Herod is struck by remorse suddenly about all the killings of the rabbis and others, and he asks a vital question of this sage: how can I rectify the evil I have done? Now, as I said earlier, I don't think we can buy the idea of Herod as the pious, the repentee, the Baal Tshuva, if you understand my Hebrew. Now, I'm not sure that works. However, I think we need to read into both what Josephus told us earlier in the speech of Herod, that he was trying to do something here, and what the Talmud is telling us, and that he is connecting here. He is trying to rectify something. Tikkun is the word that is used. And I think what this temple building, or this whole building of temple, is really trying to say, Herod is trying to reconcile himself with the Jewish people. For whatever reason, maybe they were pragmatic. Maybe he simply felt he'd gone too far and he would have a rebellion on his hands. Or maybe something within him stirred and said, wait a minute, I was born Idumean and I was brought up as a Roman, but at the end of the day, I am Jewish. Interestingly, he does have a connection to his Judaism. Herod, no Roman ever let him forget that he was Jewish. The day of Shabbat, the seventh day in Rome, was called Die Herodos, meaning it was the Sabbath of Herod. And Herod apparently didn't eat pork because, as I mentioned earlier, Augustus said that you could be a pig and not fear that you were in danger. And he also admonished his sister from marrying a non-Jew. And there are other ways to see that he also had a connection to his Jewish roots. But here, I think, again, we're not dealing with the Baal Tshuva, we're not dealing with a repentee, but rather with a tyrant who is trying to be reconciled with the very people he is king of, the king of the Jews. And I think what he's trying to say in the building of the temple is, too much hatred, too much animosity, too much killing on my part, of course, mostly. Let's work together to make Jerusalem great again. And you know what? The reconciliation succeeded. It had to succeed. If it hadn't have succeeded, then that temple would never have been built, because the Jews would have fought tooth and they would have fought valiantly to stop Herod from damaging their temple. As the Jews, even though the temple was a tyrant and was strong, anytime the Jews felt that there was a danger to the holiest of their places, they would lay their lives down and rebel and fight to the end. And that didn't happen. There was no rebellion when the temple was built. In fact, the Jews joined forces with Herod, the entire Jewish people, not only the Jews living in Judea. There was a huge Jewish diaspora all over the world. Millions of Jews joined in, and funds poured in from non-Jews, from Jews and non-Jews. There were a lot of God-fearing non-Jews from all over the world, whether it was in the form of the half shekel that was donated or in donations to the temple itself. Now, Josephus, look at all this money coming into Jerusalem. Wow. And all this for the temple. And Josephus tells us, for the great plenty of money they had then, Jews were rich, and the liberality of their people made this attempt of theirs to succeed in an incredible degree. Now, Herod would never have had the funds for the huge task of rebuilding this entire temple. Now he did. He also had a force of 10,000 Jewish laborers working together as one, and 1,000 priests who joined also the work job, and because they had to build the holier parts of the temple where other people were not allowed to enter. Now, not all the priests knew how to build. This was not an occupation often held by priests. So, as Josephus tells us, Herod trained them and had some of them taught the arts of stonecutters and others of carpenters. So we have a full joint cooperation of the Jews in the building of the temple. They were working all day from morning to night and every day. And the Talmud mentions it, or this is Josephus and the Talmud both. I will quote from Josephus now. It is also reported, said Josephus, that during the time that the temple was being built, it did not rain in the daytime, but that the showers fell in the nights, so that the work was not hindered. It seems that everyone was coming together, even the heavens themselves were participating in building this huge and beautiful temple. And there was a record time set here for sure for such a huge edifice. Now, I have to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. The Temple Mount was not built in a year and a half. The Temple Mount was built in 7 years, perhaps more. In fact, the Temple Mount would be continued to be built for many decades to come. The basilicas and the porticos and the beautiful buildings surrounding, but the temple itself, yes, the temple itself, the most important part of that compound, was built in only a year and a half. So this is an amazing result. And what did it look like? What was the result? Well, the rabbis who did not love Herod, in fact, the rabbis are the ones that gave him the stigma of slave or half Jew. The rabbis considered him a murderer, a mass murderer, and he's known for that and for a sexual deviation. Yes, Herod, necrophilia, according to what appears in the Talmud. But whatever the case, they praise Herod for the building of the temple. Whoever has not seen the temple of Herod saw not a beautiful building in their life. And guess what? Even the very man who destroyed the temple, Titus, on the eve of the destruction, and this is brought down to us through different sources, claims that the temple is the most magnificent of all human creations. And there's a debate there whether to tear down the temple as retribution. Josephus claims that Titus said that they shouldn't tear down the temple, but Josephus was getting paid by Titus to write history, so I'm not sure we can take that at face value. From this other source that came down in history, it seems that Herod was very keen on destroying the temple, but nevertheless, he recognized the beauty and the fantastic building. And what about Jerusalem? Did Jerusalem become great again? It sure did. And the best to testify to that would be the greatest geographer, Roman geographer of ancient time, that's Pliny the Elder, who wrote the volumes of natural history, which covers the geography of all the world, telling the stories, and written in the 1st century. And in this book, Pliny writes that Jerusalem is longa clarissima urbium orientus, the most illustrious city in the East, giving this awarding it with the highest of titles. And so now our question, summing up, is, well, so how shall we remember Herod? Now, I will give you the two sides of the dilemma as Josephus writes them himself. Josephus lived many decades after Herod, but summing up, he said the following. Now, some there are who stand amazed at the diversity of Herod's nature and purposes. We give respect to his magnificence and the benefits which he bestowed on all mankind. But when anyone looks upon the punishments he inflicted and the injuries he did, not only to his subjects, but to his nearest relations, and takes notice of his severe and unrelenting disposition, he will be forced to accept that he was brutish and a stranger to all humanity. Now, it's interesting that Josephus in the end is going to give Herod a good bill. He's going to give him credit, but we don't have to listen to him because, again, Josephus is writing this book, and a copy of the book he himself writes, he is going to give to Herod's great-grandson, so he can't be too critical at the end of the day. But now we have to ask ourselves, what verdict do we give Herod? Was he mad? Or was he magnificent? Was he Herod the evil or Herod the great? I'll let you decide that. As for now, we have finished our lecture. Thank you very much. Chag Sameach to all.
Okay, thank you so much, Aaron, for having this lecture, giving this lecture here. And in the name of the City of David, I would also thank everyone who joined both on Zoom and on Facebook. The recording will be live soon on Facebook and on YouTube. And stay tuned for the next lectures. The next one will take place on Monday next week at the same time. Thank you so much and have a nice day.